The fluorescent lights of Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport cast harsh shadows across the departure gate as Emma Yuki adjusted the strap of her worn canvas backpack. It was March 15, 2005, and the 22-year-old woman stood quietly among a handful of other passengers waiting for the final bush plane departure of the day. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same faded denim jacket she'd had since high school, the one with the small tear near the left elbow that her grandmother had mended. With careful stitches, Emma had spent 3 days in Anchorage, visiting the tribal council offices, advocating for better healthcare resources in her village of Kivalina, a remote community of barely 400 people. Perched on the edge of the Chukchi Sea, she carried with her a manila folder, thick with documents, grant applications, and letters from elders describing the medical emergencies that required dangerous weather evacuations. The folder never left her. Sighed during those meetings, and she clutched it now as she watched the small Cessna 207 being prepped on the tarmac. The security camera positioned above Gate 7 captured Emma's final moments in the terminal with clinical precision at 4:40. 7 p.m. she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, who later told investigators that Emma seemed tired, but determined the agent remembered thinking the young woman looked like she carried the weight of her entire community on her shoulders. At 4:52 p.m., Emma walked across the tarmac toward the aircraft, her boots crunching on patches of ice that maintenance crews hadn't quite cleared. Pilot Rick Hoffman had been flying Alaska's bush routes for 16 years without incident, his logbooks meticulously maintained and later scrutinized by federal investigators showed over 8,000 hours of flight time across some of the most challenging terrain in North America. Colleagues described him as methodical, almost obsessive about safety protocols. He conducted his pre-flight inspection with the same careful attention he applied to every departure, checking fuel levels, control surfaces, and weather conditions. With practiced efficiency, the weather report for the route to Kivalina showed clear skies with light winds conditions any experienced bush pilot would consider routine. Hoffman filed his flight plan at 4:35 p.m., indicating a direct route over the Brooks Range, with an estimated arrival time of 7:15 p.m. The plan called for a fuel stop in Kotzebue before the final leg to Kivalina's gravel airstrip. Air traffic control recorded normal radio communications as the aircraft taxied for takeoff at 5:08 p.m. The Cessna lifted off runway Aero 7R and disappeared into the vast Alaska sky. The last radio transmission came 12 minutes later as Hoffman reported passing over Eagle River, his voice calm and professional, as he confirmed his heading and altitude. After that silence, the aircraft's transponder signal vanished from radar screens at exactly 5:31 p.m., somewhere over the Talkeetna Mountains, as if the plane had simply ceased to exist. Emma's cell phone, a basic model without GPS capability, showed no activity after 4:45 p.m., her last text message sent to her younger sister Sarah while waiting at the gate. Read simply, boarding. Now see you soon, tell Mom I love her. The message would haunt investigators for years, a final glimpse into the ordinary moment before everything went wrong. As darkness fell over Anchorage that evening, the first search and rescue protocols began activating duty officers at the Rescue Coordination Center. Started plotting potential search areas, their calculations hampered by the aircraft's sudden disappearance from radar without an emergency locator beacon signal. The search zone stretched across hundreds of square miles of wilderness, encompassing frozen rivers, steep mountain valleys, and dense forests, where a small plane could remain hidden indefinitely by midnight. Emma's absence had transformed from a delayed flight into something far more ominous. The gravel airstrip in Kivalina stretched like a gray scar across the tundra, its surface worn smooth by decades of bush plane landings that connected this isolated community to the outside world. Sarah Uki stood at the edge of the runway, her breath forming white clouds in the -20 air, as she checked her watch for the dozenth time. 7:30 had come and gone, then 8. And still no sign of the familiar drone of aircraft engines approaching. From the south, other family members had gathered as word spread through the village that Emma's plane was overdue. Their grandmother, Emma Yuki, sat in the passenger seat of a pickup truck, with the engine running, her weathered hands folded in her lap, as she stared down the empty runway at 83 Helen had lived through. Enough harsh winters and delayed flights to know the difference between ordinary delays and something wrong. The way she held her silence spoke louder than any words of worry. Emma's mother, Ruth, paced back and forth between the truck and the small terminal building, a converted shipping container that served as Cavallina's airport operations center. She tried calling Emma's cell phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. The cheerful message in Emma's voice, "Hi, you've reached Emma. Leave me a message and I'll call you back," became more painful with each repetition. Ruth had memorized every inflection, every pause in her daughter's recorded words. The village's only radio operator, an elderly man named Thomas Anderson, maintained contact with air traffic control in Anchorage from his cramped station inside the terminal. Static filled the small room as he repeatedly called for updates, his voice growing more strained with each transmission. The responses from the city grew increasingly non-committal as hours passed. Weather delays, they said. Initially, then equipment problems, then the most dreaded phrase in bush aviation, "We've lost." Contact Cavallina had endured tragedies before the Arctic Ocean claimed its share of hunters and fishermen, and the unforgiving landscape had taken others who ventured too far from safety. But Emma was different. She was their advocate, their voice. In the bureaucratic maze of state and federal agencies, she carried their hopes for better health care, improved housing and protection of their traditional hunting grounds. Her absence created a void that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. As midnight approached, Ruth made the decision to contact every family member scattered across Alaska's North Slope. Phone calls went out to cousins in Barrow, uncles in Nome, and relatives who had moved to Anchorage for work. The network of kinship that bound native communities together began mobilizing, even though no one quite knew what action to take. Search and rescue operations fell under federal jurisdiction, leaving the family powerless except to wait and worry. Sarah, only 19 and still finishing her correspondence courses for a nursing degree, found herself becoming the family's liaison with outside authorities. She wrote down every phone number, every contact name, every detail shared by investigators who called with updates that contained no real information. Her notebook filled with times, dates, and the names of officials who promised to call back, but rarely did. The tribal council convened an emergency session at dawn, gathering in the community center as news of Emma's disappearance spread throughout the village council. Chairman Robert Sage had worked with Emma on numerous projects and knew her dedication to their community's welfare. He understood that her loss would be felt far beyond her immediate family. The grant she'd been pursuing, the healthcare initiatives she'd championed, the advocacy work that had consumed her energy, all of it now hung in uncertain balance. Emma Yuki remained largely silent during these first terrible hours, but those who knew her recognized the signs of deep grief beginning to take hold. She'd raised Emma and Sarah after their father died in a fishing accident, and Emma's determination to help their people had reminded Helen of her own younger self, the old woman's. Silence contained decades of experience with loss, and her restraint spoke to a wisdom that understood how quickly hope could transform into something much darker. By morning, official search operations would begin, but the damage was already done. Emma Yuki had vanished into the vast Alaska wilderness, leaving behind a community that depended on her and a family that would never be the same. The storm system that swept across south-central Alaska on March 16th arrived with the merciless timing that had claimed countless aircraft over the decades. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour grounded every search aircraft at Elmendorf Air Force Base, while snow reduced visibility to mere yards across the mountainous terrain where Emma Yuki and pilot Rick Hoffman had vanished. Rescue Coordination Center Alaska faced the agonizing reality that would haunt families across the state. When people disappear in Alaska's wilderness, weather often becomes the determining factor between life and death. Captain Derek Walsh commanded the search operations from his cramped office, overlooking the runway, where grounded helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft sat covered in accumulating snow like sleeping giants. His 30 years of Alaskan search and rescue experience had taught him to read weather patterns, like a battlefield commander. Reed's enemy movements and everything about this storm spelled disaster for anyone surviving exposure. In the back country, the temperature had dropped to -30 degrees, creating conditions that would prove fatal within hours for anyone inadequately sheltered. The search zone encompassed over 800 square miles of some of Alaska's most unforgiving terrain, steep valleys carved by ancient glaciers created microclimates where aircraft could crash and remain invisible from above. Even in clear weather, the Talkeetna Mountains rose like jagged teeth from the landscape, their peaks shrouded in clouds that seemed to mock the sophisticated radar systems designed to track aircraft movements. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, a small Cessna had simply vanished, taking with it a young woman whose family waited in increasingly desperate agony. Sarah Yuki maintained a vigil by the radio, in Kivalina transcribing every update from rescue coordinators who seemed to speak in careful euphemisms designed to avoid crushing hope while acknowledging grim realities. The phrase "weather permitting" appeared in every communication, a reminder that nature controlled the timeline of their search for Emma. Sarah's notebook, filled with meteorological terms that she'd never needed to understand before: ceiling heights, visibility ranges, wind shear conditions, and precipitation forecasts that determined whether search crews could even attempt to reach potential crash sites. On the second day, a brief clearing allowed a single reconnaissance flight over the primary search area. The pilot, a veteran named Marcus Stewart, who had participated in dozens of similar missions, reported back with the stark efficiency that characterized emergency communications: dense forest canopy, steep terrain, multiple avalanche zones, and no visible signs of aircraft wreckage. The 40-minute flight had covered perhaps 10% of the total search area before deteriorating conditions forced a hasty return to base. Ruth Yuki had driven from Kivalina to Anchorage, unable to remain passive. While her daughter remained missing, she established herself in a small hotel near the airport, transforming her room into an unofficial command center, where she maintained contact with multiple agencies. Simultaneously, the Alaska State Troopers, Civil Air Patrol, and military search coordinators each provided different information, creating a confusing web of jurisdictions and protocols that seemed designed to prevent, rather than facilitate, effective search operations. The third day brought the most devastating weather, yet satellite imagery showed the storm intensifying rather than moving through, with meteorologists predicting another 48 hours of conditions that would keep search aircraft grounded. Captain Walsh faced the mathematical reality that governed all search and rescue operations. Survival time decreased exponentially with each passing hour, while search effectiveness remained at zero as long as weather prevented deployment of assets. When the storm finally broke on March 19th, the massive search operation launched with coordinated precision. 6 helicopters and 4 fixed-wing aircraft departed Anchorage before dawn, their crews knowing that any survivors would now be fighting hypothermia. After 4 days of exposure, the search grid had been divided into sectors, with each aircraft assigned specific coordinates and altitudes to maximize coverage, while preventing mid-air collisions in the mountainous terrain. At 2:17 p.m., helicopter pilot Lieutenant Jennifer Cooper spotted metallic debris glinting in afternoon sunlight near a frozen creek bed Approximately 200 miles northwest of the planned flight route, the wreckage lay scattered across a clearing surrounded by spruce trees, the aircraft's blue and white paint scheme visible against the snow-covered landscape. Cooper's radio transmission back to base carried the weight of 4 days of desperate searching. "We have located the aircraft deploying ground team to assess for survivors." Rick Hoffman emerged from his medically induced coma on March 23rd with the disoriented confusion of a man whose memory had been fragmented by severe head trauma. The 48-year-old pilot lay in Providence, Alaska Medical Center, surrounded by the sophisticated monitoring equipment that had kept him alive during the critical first days after his rescue. From the crash site, his wife Carol maintained a bedside vigil, watching for signs of recognition in eyes that seemed to struggle with basic focus, let alone the complex task of reconstructing the events that had led to this sterile hospital room. Dr. Patricia Manning, the neurologist overseeing Hoffman's care, explained to investigators that traumatic brain injuries often created retrograde amnesia, particularly regarding events immediately preceding the trauma. However, the extent and nature of Hoffman's memory loss presented unusual characteristics that complicated both his medical treatment and the ongoing investigation into Emma Yuki's disappearance. He remembered his childhood in detail, could recite aviation regulations verbatim, and recognized family members without difficulty, but the hours surrounding the crash remained completely blank. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant James Coslow conducted the first formal interview 3 days after Hoffman regained consciousness, establishing a careful protocol that balanced the urgent need for information with medical restrictions on the patient's condition. The pilot's responses revealed a man grappling with fragments of memory that seemed to conflict with the physical. Evidence recovered from the crash site, he remembered departing Anchorage, normally completing standard radio communications and maintaining visual flight rules through clear weather conditions, but everything after passing Eagle River remained. Shrouded in confusion, the medical evidence painted a picture of violence that extended beyond what investigators would expect from the crash itself. Hoffman's injuries included a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and numerous lacerations, but also defensive wounds on his hands and forearms that suggested a struggle had occurred either before or during the crash sequence. Dr. Manning noted unusual bruising patterns on his throat and wrists that appeared inconsistent with typical aviation accident trauma, though she acknowledged that the unusual circumstances of the crash made definitive conclusions difficult. When investigators pressed Hoffman about Emma Yuki, his responses became increasingly agitated and contradictory. He insisted that he remembered her boarding. The aircraft described her as a quiet passenger who seemed preoccupied with paperwork, but claimed no memory of conversations during the flight or any unusual behavior that might explain the dramatic deviation from his filed flight plan. His inability to explain how the aircraft ended up 200 miles off course created growing suspicion among investigators, though medical experts cautioned against assuming deliberate deception given the extent of his head injuries. The most disturbing aspect of Hoffman's testimony emerged during his 4th interview, when he began describing vivid nightmares that featured a woman's voice pleading for help. He couldn't identify the voice or place it in any specific context, but the emotional intensity of these dreams seemed to suggest suppressed memories struggling to surface. Dr. Manning observed that patients with traumatic brain injuries sometimes experience fragmented recollections as dreams or hallucinations, making it impossible to distinguish between actual memories and unconscious fabrications. Carol Hoffman grew increasingly protective of her husband as the investigation intensified, hiring an attorney who began limiting access to the pilot and questioning the aggressive nature of police interviews. She insisted that her husband was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, pointing to his 16-year safety record and the testimonials from colleagues who described him as methodical and professional. The suggestion that Rick might have been involved in Emma's disappearance struck her as impossible, though she acknowledged that his memory loss prevented him from defending himself against growing suspicions. Polygraph examinations proved inconclusive due to Hoffman's medical condition, while psychological evaluations revealed a man genuinely traumatized by his inability to remember critical events. The pilot expressed genuine anguish about Emma's fate, repeatedly asking investigators whether she had been found and showing emotional distress when informed that her body remained missing. These responses seemed inconsistent with the behavior of someone deliberately concealing information, yet they also failed to provide the answers that Emma's family desperately needed, as weeks passed without significant improvement. In Hoffman's memory, the investigation reached an impasse that would define the case for decades to come. The sole witness to Emma Yuki's final hours remained locked within his own damaged consciousness, leaving investigators with physical evidence that raised more questions than answers, and a growing sense that the truth lay buried beneath layers of trauma and time that might never be penetrated. The crime scene technicians who arrived at the crash site on March 24th had processed dozens of aviation accidents across Alaska's wilderness, but the debris pattern surrounding Rick Hoffman's Cessna defied their understanding of typical crash dynamics. Evidence recovery specialist Donna Murphy led the team through the scattered wreckage, her trained eyes immediately detecting inconsistencies that would haunt the investigation for years to come. The aircraft had impacted the frozen ground at a relatively shallow angle, suggesting a controlled descent rather than an uncontrolled plunge, yet personal belongings were distributed across an area that seemed impossibly wide for the apparent severity of the crash. Emma Yuki's canvas backpack lay approximately 50 yards from the main wreckage, its contents spilled across the snow in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than random distribution. During impact, a manila folder of tribal council documents remained pristinely intact inside a plastic sleeve, while other papers had been scattered by wind across the crash site. Murphy photographed each item's position before collection, noting that Emma's personal effects seemed to follow no logical trajectory from the aircraft's final resting place. The most puzzling discovery came when searcher Michael Torres spotted a glint of silver, nearly a quarter-mile from the wreckage, buried beneath a thin layer of snow that had accumulated since the crash. Emma's traditional silver bracelet, a family heirloom crafted by her great-grandmother, lay completely undamaged beside a cluster of spruce trees. The bracelet's pristine condition contrasted sharply with other recovered items that showed impact damage or exposure to the elements more troubling. Still, the bracelet's location placed it uphill from the crash site, requiring it to have traveled against gravity and basic physics to reach its final position. Forensic pathologist Dr. Rebecca Chen arrived on the second day of scene processing to examine the limited biological evidence recovered from the aircraft. Blood spatter patterns inside the cockpit suggested that Hoffman had sustained his head injury during the crash sequence, but traces of blood found on the passenger seat presented a different story entirely. The blood evidence appeared to have been deposited while the aircraft was level and stable, not during the violent deceleration of impact. Laboratory analysis would later confirm that this blood belonged to Emma Yuki, raising disturbing questions about what had occurred during the flight. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant James Kozloff supervised the evidence recovery with growing unease, as each new discovery contradicted the apparent simplicity of an aviation accident. Emma's winter boots were found in different locations, one near the aircraft and another 30 yards away, as if she had been walking or running barefoot through snow that would have caused frostbite. Within minutes, the pattern suggested struggle or flight, but from what and to where remained inexplicable given the remote location and absence of any other human presence. The aircraft's emergency locator beacon had been manually deactivated, a fact that explained the delayed discovery of the crash site, but raised immediate suspicions about pilot intent. Hoffman's logbook showed meticulous attention to safety protocols throughout his career, making the beacon's deactivation seem completely inconsistent with his established patterns of behavior. However, medical experts cautioned that head trauma could cause personality changes and impaired judgment, leaving investigators uncertain whether the deactivation represented criminal intent or medical crisis photography of the scene. Revealed subtle disturbances in the snow surrounding the crash site that suggested human activity beyond what would be expected from the immediate aftermath of an accident. Bootprints LED away from the wreckage in multiple directions, some appearing fresh, while others had been partially obscured by wind and weather. The prints were too degraded for definitive identification, but their presence indicated that someone had spent considerable time at the crash site after impact, possibly searching for something or attempting to alter the scene. Emma's cell phone was never recovered, despite extensive searches using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. The device's absence seemed particularly significant given that other electronic equipment, including Hoffman's GPS unit and portable radio, remained intact. Within the wreckage, investigators theorized that the phone might contain evidence of communications during the flight or location data that could explain the aircraft's deviation from its planned route, making its disappearance another troubling element in a case that defied simple explanations. As the evidence recovery team completed their work and prepared to transport the wreckage for detailed analysis, the accumulated inconsistencies created a picture that no single theory could adequately explain. Emma Yuki had vanished from a crash scene that bore her blood, but not her body, leaving behind a trail of evidence that seemed deliberately obscured and a pilot whose memory loss prevented any hope of immediate answers. The final investigative report on Emma Yuki's disappearance landed on the desk of Alaska State Trooper Captain Robert Sullivan in late September 2005. Its 73 pages, representing 6 months of intensive investigation that had consumed significant resources. While producing frustratingly inconclusive results, the document bore the clinical language of official findings, but between its carefully worded paragraphs lay the acknowledgement of a case that had defeated the combined efforts of state troopers, federal investigators, and specialized forensic teams, the conclusion delivered in bureaucratic prose that seemed designed to minimize controversy, classified Emma's disappearance as a probable fatality resulting from exposure following an aviation accident. Sullivan had supervised dozens of similar cases throughout his career, but Emma's file contained anomalies that troubled him long after the investigation officially closed. The evidence suggested neither a straightforward accident nor a clear crime, leaving investigators trapped in an uncomfortable middle ground where suspicions couldn't be proven and coincidences seemed too numerous to accept. The pilot's memory loss provided convenient cover for any potential criminal activity, while the scattered evidence could be explained by the chaotic dynamics of a wilderness crash, though neither explanation felt entirely satisfactory. Ruth Uki's protests against the case closure filled 3 separate folders in the administrative files, each letter typed on the Tribal Council's letterhead and copied to state legislators, federal agencies, and native rights organizations. Her correspondence revealed a mother's desperate determination to keep her daughter's case active, but also highlighted the bureaucratic inertia that often surrounded investigations in remote Alaska communities. Ruth's letters grew increasingly bitter over the months, accusing investigators of cultural bias and suggesting that Emma's disappearance would have received more attention if she had been a white woman from Anchorage. The Yuki family's attorney, Maria Gonzalez, filed formal appeals challenging the investigation's conclusions and demanding that the case remain open as a missing person file rather than a presumed death. Her legal briefs, meticulously researched and passionately argued, pointed to the physical evidence that contradicted the official narrative of an accident victim whose body was simply never recovered. However, Alaska's vast wilderness contained hundreds of people who had vanished without trace, and the legal system showed little appetite for indefinitely maintaining investigations based on inconclusive evidence and family suspicions. Sarah Yuki, now thrust into the role of family spokesperson at age 19, found herself navigating a complex maze of jurisdictional boundaries and procedural requirements that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist families seeking answers. The FBI claimed no federal jurisdiction, since no specific crime had been proven, while state authorities argued that their investigation had been thorough within the constraints of available evidence. The circular nature of these bureaucratic responses left the family feeling abandoned by the very systems that should have protected Emma. Pilot Rick Hoffman's medical recovery progressed slowly through the summer months, with gradual improvement in his physical condition, but no significant restoration of memories from the day of the crash. His neurologist, Dr. Patricia Manning, cautioned that the specific memories might never return, leaving investigators permanently deprived of the only witness account that could explain Emma's fate. Hoffman's own frustration with his memory loss seemed genuine, and he cooperated fully with multiple interview attempts, but his inability to provide answers gradually transformed him from potential suspect to another victim of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The bureaucratic machinery that governed such cases eventually demanded closure, despite the unresolved questions that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Budget constraints, personnel limitations, and the reality of new cases requiring attention combined to create inexorable pressure for administrative resolution. Captain Sullivan signed the final report with reluctance, knowing that the case would join hundreds of similar files stored in warehouse facilities where Alaska's unsolved mysteries accumulated like geological sediment. Emma's official death certificate was issued in December 2nd, 2005, a legal necessity that allowed her family to settle insurance matters and access survivor benefits, but which felt like a betrayal of hope that she might somehow still be alive. The document listed the cause of death as exposure following aircraft accident, a clinical phrase that reduced a vibrant young woman's life to bureaucratic terminology for her family. The certificate represented not closure, but abandonment, the system's surrender in the face of a mystery. It lacked the resources or determination to solve. The case files were boxed and transferred to long-term storage, where they would remain essentially untouched for the next 17 years, gathering dust, while Emma's family continued their private search for answers that the official investigation had failed to provide. Sarah Yuki transformed her grief into obsession with methodical precision, converting her small apartment in Anchorage into an unofficial command center where Emma's case consumed every available surface and most of her waking thoughts. By 2010, the walls were covered with maps marking revised constantly as new theories occurred to her. Her nursing career provided the analytical skills necessary to process forensic reports and medical documentation, while her cultural connections within Alaska's native communities created an informal network of information that often proved more valuable than official channels. The passage of years had done nothing to diminish Sarah's certainty that her sister's disappearance involved criminal activity rather than the tragic accident. Described in the official report, she maintained correspondence with retired investigators, aviation experts, and even psychics who claimed insights into Emma's fate, pursuing every lead, regardless of how unlikely it seemed. Her apartment's dining table disappeared beneath stacks of documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealing the bureaucratic machinery that had ultimately failed her family. Ruthuki's health declined steadily through the decades, the stress of Emma's disappearance accelerating the diabetes and heart problems that plagued many members of their community. Sarah watched her mother's vibrant advocacy transform into resigned bitterness, the energy that had once fueled angry letters to politicians, now channeled into quiet visits to Emma's empty grave in the Kivalina cemetery. The headstone bore only Emma's name and birth date, the absence of a death date serving as a permanent reminder of questions that remained unanswered. The technological advances that revolutionized criminal investigation during the early offered tantalizing possibilities for reviewing Emma's case, but gaining access to modern forensic techniques required resources and official support that the family couldn't obtain. Sarah spent countless hours researching DNA analysis improvements, satellite imagery enhancement, and digital reconstruction methods that might reveal new evidence from the original crime scene photographs. However, the case's closed status created bureaucratic barriers that seemed insurmountable without new evidence or witness testimony. Rick Hoffman had rebuilt his life carefully after the crash, relocating to Oregon, where he worked as a flight instructor at a small municipal airport. His interactions with Sarah over the years carried the weight of shared trauma. Though his continued memory loss prevented any meaningful insights into Emma's disappearance, their conversations, usually initiated by Sarah's annual phone calls on the anniversary of the crash, followed predictable patterns of questions he couldn't answer and apologies that felt increasingly hollow over time. The Internet's expansion during the late provided Sarah with new tools for research and advocacy, allowing her to create websites and social media pages dedicated to Emma's case. These digital memorials attracted attention from amateur investigators, true crime enthusiasts, and other families dealing with similar losses, creating a community bound together by frustration with official indifference. However, the online exposure also attracted conspiracy theorists and attention seekers whose wild speculation often obscured legitimate investigative efforts. Sarah's personal relationships suffered under the weight of her single-minded focus on Emma's case. Potential romantic partners found themselves competing with a ghost for her attention, while friendships withered as conversations inevitably returned to evidence analysis and investigative theories. Her nursing colleagues respected her professional competence, but grew uncomfortable with her tendency to relate every missing person case to her sister's disappearance, creating an isolation that deepened her dependence on the case as her primary source of purpose. The 20th anniversary of Emma's disappearance in 2025 arrived with Sarah now approaching 40. Her youth, consumed by a search that had defined her entire adult life, the passage of time had eliminated most of the original investigators through retirement or death, while witnesses had scattered across the continent or lost interest in events that seemed increasingly distant. Yet Sarah's determination remained undiminished, sustained by a sister's love and the growing certainty that someone somewhere possessed the knowledge necessary to finally bring Emma home. The breakthrough that would ultimately crack Emma Yuki's case emerged not from traditional investigative work, but from the relentless advancement of technology that had revolutionized forensic science since 2005. In January 2022, Dr. Amanda Chen, a forensic geneticist at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, received an unusual request from Sarah Yuki to review biological evidence that had been stored in the State Crime Laboratory for 17 years. The preserved blood samples from Emma's case had been collected using protocols that seemed primitive by modern standards, but they contained genetic material that contemporary analysis techniques could examine with unprecedented precision. Sarah had spent months negotiating with state officials to gain access to the stored evidence, leveraging media attention and political pressure from native rights organizations to overcome bureaucratic resistance. The samples had been stored in a temperature-controlled facility designed for long-term preservation, though degradation over time presented significant challenges for analysis. Dr. Chen's laboratory specialized in extracting usable DNA from degraded samples, employing amplification techniques that could generate genetic profiles from biological material too damaged for traditional testing methods. The initial results confirmed what investigators had suspected 17 years. Earlier, the blood found on the passenger seat belonged to Emma Yuki, establishing definitively that she had been injured during the flight rather than after the crash. However, advanced testing revealed additional genetic material that previous analysis had missed. Entirely mixed within Emma's blood were trace amounts of DNA from an unknown male contributor, suggesting close physical contact that had resulted in the transfer of biological material between individuals. Simultaneously, advances in satellite imagery analysis had made it possible to examine archived photographs of the crash site with resolution and detail unavailable to investigators in 2005. Dr. Michael Roberts, a specialist in digital forensics at the Alaska State Crime Laboratory, employed machine learning algorithms to enhance decades-old aerial photographs, revealing previously invisible disturbances in the landscape surrounding the wreckage. The enhanced images showed evidence of human activity that extended far beyond what would be expected from rescue operations or evidence recovery efforts. The most significant technological breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the development of advanced geographic information systems that could model aircraft flight paths with extraordinary precision. Aviation safety expert Patricia Williams used GPS data, weather records, and radar tracking information to create computer simulations of every possible route that Hoffman's aircraft could have taken on. The day of the crash, her analysis revealed that reaching the crash site would have required deliberate navigation decisions that contradicted Hoffman's testimony about flying in clear weather. With good visibility, Sarah had maintained contact with cold case investigators across multiple agencies, and her persistence finally paid dividends when Detective Lieutenant Marcus Thompson of the Alaska State Troopers agreed to review Emma's case using modern investigative techniques. Thompson specialized in applying contemporary forensic methods to historical cases, and his examination of the evidence photographs revealed details that previous investigators had overlooked. Tool marks on Emma's recovered bracelet suggested it had been deliberately removed using pliers or similar implements, contradicting the theory that it had been lost during the crash. The genetic profile from the unknown male contributor was uploaded to CODIS, the federal DNA database that had expanded dramatically. Since Emma's disappearance, the system contained millions of profiles from convicted criminals, arrestees, and missing persons, creating possibilities for identification that hadn't existed when the case was originally investigated. However, the initial database searches produced no matches, suggesting that the contributor either had no criminal history or had successfully avoided detection for decades. Dr. Chen's laboratory also employed isotope analysis on preserved tissue samples, a technique that could reveal information about geographic origins and dietary patterns. The results indicated that Emma had consumed food containing specific mineral signatures consistent with her home region, but also detected traces of substances that suggested she had been given medication or possibly drugged during her final hours. The implications were disturbing, providing the first concrete evidence that Emma's disappearance might have involved premeditation rather than crimes of opportunity. These technological advances created momentum for reopening Emma's case after 17 years of official indifference, but they also raised troubling questions about how much evidence had been overlooked by the original investigation. The enhanced satellite imagery, genetic analysis, and forensic reconstruction painted a picture of deliberate criminal activity that had been disguised as an aviation accident, suggesting that someone had successfully concealed murder for nearly 2 decades. The knock on David Lauren's door came at 5 a.m. on October 15, 2022, shattering the quiet morning routine of a man who had spent 17 years believing he had successfully buried his darkest secrets beneath Alaska's frozen ground. Laurent, now 63, and recently retired from his position as operations manager for Arctic Air Services, answered the door in his bathrobe to find 8 federal agents armed with search warrants and arrest documents that would destroy the carefully constructed life he had built. Since Emma Yuki's disappearance, the DNA profile recovered from Emma's blood had finally found its match not through CODIS, but through a genealogical database that Lauren's daughter had used to research family history the previous year. The Genetic Genealogy Investigation, LED, by forensic genetic genealogist Rebecca Martinez had traced the DNA through multiple family lines before identifying Lauren as the source of the biological material. Found mixed with Emma's blood in Rick Hoffman's aircraft, the process had taken 8 months of meticulous analysis, but it provided investigators with the first concrete link between Emma's disappearance and a specific individual Laurent's arrest, sent shockwaves through Alaska's tight-knit aviation community, where he was known as a respected professional who had helped coordinate search and rescue operations for missing aircraft throughout his career. His colleagues at Arctic Air Services struggled to reconcile the man they knew methodical safety, conscious and deeply committed to helping stranded pilots with the monster described in the federal indictment. The irony was particularly bitter for families who had depended on Laurent's expertise during their own searches for missing loved ones, never knowing that he possessed intimate knowledge of how people could vanish in Alaska's wilderness. The federal investigation that followed Lauren's arrest revealed a pattern of behavior that had remained hidden for decades. Financial records showed that he had made regular cash deposits following several disappearances of young Native women throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, suggesting a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Emma's case. Bank surveillance footage from 2005 showed Laura making a significant cash deposit just 3 days after Emma's disappearance. Though he had claimed to be conducting routine business during that period, Sarah Yuki received the phone call about Lauren's arrest while she was working a night shift at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, the same hospital where Rick Hoffman had recovered from his injuries 17 years earlier. The news hit her with devastating emotional force, validating decades of suspicion while simultaneously opening wounds that had never properly healed. Her immediate reaction was relief that someone would finally be held accountable for Emma's death. But that relief was quickly replaced by rage at the system that had allowed Laurent to remain free for so long. The investigation into Laurent's background revealed a man who had used his position within Alaska's aviation industry to identify vulnerable targets and exploit the state's geographic isolation to conceal his crimes. He had access to flight schedules, passenger manifests, and detailed knowledge of search and rescue protocols that would be employed when aircraft went missing. His legitimate role in coordinating emergency responses had provided perfect cover for criminal activities, allowing him to influence search efforts and potentially misdirect investigations away from evidence. That might implicate him. Retired pilot Rick Hoffman, now living quietly in Oregon, learned of Lauren's arrest through a phone call from Sarah Yuki that brought him face to face with the possibility that his memory loss might not have been purely accidental. Medical experts had noted that his injuries included signs of blunt force trauma that could have resulted from an assault rather than the crash itself. The revelation that Laurent had been present during Emma's final hours raised disturbing questions about whether Hoffman's amnesia was the result of deliberate violence designed to eliminate the only witness to Emma's fate. The arrest warrant detailed evidence that Laura had been aboard Hoffman's aircraft on the day of Emma's disappearance, having claimed engine trouble with his own plane that required emergency evacuation from a remote airstrip. This fabricated emergency had provided him with an opportunity to intercept the flight and gain access to Emma while maintaining plausible deniability about his presence in the area. The precision of the plan suggested careful preparation and intimate knowledge of both Hoffman's route and Emma's travel schedule. The full scope of David Lauren's criminal enterprise emerged slowly through months of intensive investigation that peeled back layers of deception. Spanning nearly 3 decades, FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, LED, a joint task force that included Alaska state troopers, tribal law enforcement, and federal prosecutors, all working to uncover the systematic predation that had claimed Emma Yuki and potentially dozens of other young Native women across Alaska's most remote communities. The investigation revealed a network of corruption and violence that had exploited Alaska's geographic isolation and institutional indifference to Native concerns. Laurent's confession, delivered through his attorney in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, provided chilling details about Emma's final hours that would haunt everyone who heard them. He had boarded Hoffman's aircraft, claiming mechanical problems with his own plane, then administered a sedative to Emma during the flight under the pretense of treating air sickness. When she lost consciousness, Laurent had instructed Hoffman to deviate from the planned route, directing him to a remote landing strip that Laurent used for his criminal activities. Hoffman's resistance to these demands had resulted in the struggle that caused his head injuries and subsequent memory loss. The landing strip, identified through enhanced satellite imagery, and Laurent's confession, was located on private property that he had purchased under a false identity in 1998. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple burial sites in the surrounding forest containing remains of women who had disappeared over the past 25 years. Each victim had been traveling alone through Alaska's remote regions when they encountered Laurent through his various roles within the aviation industry. Emma had been his final victim, her disappearance marking the end of a killing spree that had claimed at least 14 lives. The discovery of Emma's remains brought Sarah Uki the closure she had sought for 17 years, but it also forced her to confront the reality that her sister had endured unimaginable suffering before her death. The forensic evidence revealed that Emma had fought desperately against her captor, sustaining injuries that indicated prolonged torture before Laurent finally killed her. Her traditional silver bracelet, found so far from the crash site, had been placed there deliberately as part of Laurent's effort to create false evidence, suggesting she had survived the crash and died of exposure. Rick Hoffman's memory began returning in fragments after Laurent's confession, the psychological trauma that had suppressed his recollections finally beginning to heal as the truth emerged. He remembered being forced at gunpoint to land at Laurent's remote strip, then being beaten unconscious when he attempted to radio for help. His survival had been accidental rather than planned, the result of Laurent's assumption that the head trauma would prove fatal. The pilot's 17 years of guilt and confusion gave way to a different kind of anguish as he realized how close he had come to preventing Emma's death. The institutional failures that had allowed Laurent to operate undetected for decades became the subject of federal investigations that exposed systematic bias and negligence within Alaska's law enforcement agencies. The pattern of dismissed reports, inadequate investigations, and bureaucratic indifference to Native concerns had created an environment where predators could operate with virtual impunity. Changes in protocols, training, and accountability measures would emerge from these revelations, though they came too late for Emma and the other victims whose lives could have been saved. Sarah Uki's advocacy work evolved from a personal quest for justice into a broader movement to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Throughout North America, Emma's case became a symbol of the institutional changes needed to protect vulnerable communities from predators who exploited geographic isolation and cultural prejudice to conceal their crimes. The Alaska Native Women's Coalition, founded in Emma's memory, worked to ensure that no other family would endure the decades of abandonment and indifference that had defined the Uki families. Experience. The final chapter of Emma Yuki's story was written not in the courtroom where Laurent received multiple life sentences, but in the small cemetery in Kivalina, where her remains were finally laid to rest beside her grandmother Helen, who had died in 2019, still hoping for answers. The headstone now bore both birth and death dates, marking the end of a mystery that had consumed 2 decades and forever changed everyone it touched, yet for those who seek justice for the forgotten victims of violent crime. Emma's legacy continues to shed light on the darkest corners where evil thrives in silence, reminding us that the truth, however long buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. If you're moved by Emma's story and want to hear more cases like this one, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about what drives someone to commit such heinous acts. Your engagement helps us bring attention to these forgotten victims and the families who never stop searching for answers.